For use with my 6K, I brought from my past life as a Canon user my trusty old Tokina 11-16 f2.8 and some prime lenses. I then added a 17-55 EFS, which had some of the most surreal and busy bokeh that I've ever seen. Eventually, I realized that I was missing out. I wasn't done at 55mm and I always craved for more. And then began my search for an alternative zoom lens. It had to have the following features. It had to be an EF lens, as the high flange distance on the 6K wouldn't realistically allow me to use most lenses with other mounts. It had to have full frame coverage, so I could also use it with my A7S II with an adapter, which I couldn't do with the 17-55. For spontaneous travels with not much space in the bag, it had to be wide enough that I wouldn't miss my wide-angle lens, and yet it had to be narrow enough to help me get up close and personal. It had to have image stabilization, so I could at least try to use the 6K handheld as often as possible. I mean, this thing is just weighted so inappropriately that it's impossible to hold it steadily, especially if it's naked and without its rig. It would have to have constant aperture that didn't vary as I zoomed in, so I could use it in documentaries for establishing shots, for instance. Now, I understand that this is a lot to ask for from a lens, but that's the beauty of the EF mount. It's been around long enough that every realistic configuration already exists. The internet told me that the 17-55 I had was damn near an L series lens, and because I've used many of these lenses several times in the past as rentals, I was already familiar with the quality that I could expect from an L lens. You've seen the title of this video and the thumbnail and the fact that this is right here, so this is a bit of a pointless reveal. But I love this lens so much that I'm going to do it anyway. Let's take a look at some shots. Things blow me away about this lens. The ability to frame my shots with so much range has made it possible for me to think differently as a cinematographer. I have so many more options now on the specifics of what it is I want to highlight in my shot. I use the telephoto end a lot, and yes, I use that especially when I'm around birds and animals so that I can give them space, but between 24 and 105mm, there's a lot of options. The second thing that blows my mind is how good the image stabilization is. I have the first version of this lens, and I'm aware that there's also a second version that is probably even better. But even the first version does miracles when it comes to taking out most of the micro jitters that prevented me from even considering using the 6K handheld without a rig. for the most part, I tend to agree that owning a specific bit of gear doesn't make you a better artist or something. But since I've owned this lens, I feel like I've gained something intangible and significant. Perspective. After using this lens as my daily workhorse, I've noticed a change in the type of shots that I want to take in the first place. As I'm from the Himalayas, I've always loved wild animals. I mean, I'm not much of a wildlife photographer or cinematographer, but now I find myself quite a bit more interested in wild things. And as I've been locked down in Stuttgart for over a year, I've started exploring the wildlife close to where I live for a start. Let's talk drawbacks. It's very difficult to design lenses which can offer a large aperture as well as a long zoom range simultaneously. And that's why most cheap lenses have an f number that varies as you zoom in. This, however, stays constant at f4. I'll be honest, it would have been a game changer for this lens if it was an f2.8, but at f4 with half the amount of light entering, it's not the most practical option for low light work, at which point you'll be pushing your camera even if it's the A7S series. It also has no lens lock, so if you're running around chasing something, if that's the kind of work you do, you'll need to reframe. But to be honest, the resistance is high enough that realistically it's not going to be a problem. You'll be fine. Now the 24-105 is not a new lens. It's not vintage or anything, but it's getting up there. The used market is therefore pretty competitive and it's super affordable right now. Mine is a 2006 model for which I paid something like 385 euros. For that price, the performance is incredible and the ownership experience is just amazing. I almost didn't like to take my 6K out for spontaneous films anymore, which is why I got the A7S II. Honestly, it's not hard for me to give you a final verdict on this lens. I shoot maybe twice as much as I used to after I got this lens. It's pure pleasure. In fact, I like this lens so much that I've made a more or less permanent modification to my 6K with what's inside this box.